Dear ladies and gentlemen, a very warm welcome to our today's event, Threat Perception and Deterrence after the Ukraine war, both to our participants here in the room, as well as to our participants who are joining us via Zoom virtually. My name is Paul Linnartz. I'm head of the director of the US office of the German Konrad-Adenauer-Stiftung, or in English, Konrad-Adenauer Foundation, based here in Washington, DC. This event launches a new report by the National Security Policy Center at the University of Virginia, published by Konrad-Adenauer-Stiftung USA. The report sets out to create a new understanding of deterrence and risk in this era of tripolar great power competition. When we approached Professor Phil Potter at the beginning of this year, roughly in February, to discuss a possible report about deterrence and threat perception, the approach focused, of course, on Russia's war of aggression against Ukraine. As Phil Potter points out in his report, Russia's decision to invade Ukraine, coupled with the increasing assertiveness of Beijing's foreign policy, is raising alarm that the West is broadly failing to deter rising threats to the global rules-based order, quote unquote. And I can just subscribe to that. Although it was not within the given scope of Phil Potter's research for the report we are going to launch today, we cannot look at the issue of threat perception and deterrence anymore without also thinking about the large-scale attack by the terrorist organization Hamas on Israel. What happened in Israel since the morning of October 7 is just shocking. The brutal attack by Hamas has brought incredible suffering to countless innocent victims. Men, women, elderly, children. And the terrorist attack came as a surprise to Israel, but also to Europe and the US. And no one is currently in a position to predict how the crisis will develop further. As I said before, Israel, the attack by Hamas on Israel was not within the scope of Phil Potter's research for today's report. But to be clear, the US, Germany, we stand with Israel, and our thoughts and prayers go out to the many innocent victims, their families, and their friends. Let me hand it over now to my dear colleague, Aaron Barrett, who will introduce our distinguished panelists and will lead us through today's discussion. Aaron, the floor is yours.
Well, thank you very much, Paul. And of course, as he mentioned, I want to take a moment to recognize our panelists that are here with us today. So to my left, we have the lovely Phil Potter. Phil Potter's team at the National Security Policy Center authored the report that we're launching here today. If you haven't yet had an opportunity to read the report, you can find it on our website. There's also QR codes around the office where you can download the report for further reading. But however, in addition to authoring this fine report, Phil is a professor of politics and the founding director of the National Security Policy Center at the University of Virginia, Frank Batten's School of Leadership and Public Policy. There you go. And he's also published 2 books, served on the editorial boards of the Journal of Politics and the Journal of Global Security Studies. And Phil, thank you so much for coming today.
Thank you for having me.
Excellent. And we are also very pleased to be joined by Melanie Sisson. She is a fellow at the Foreign Policy Program Strobe Talbot Center for Security, Strategy, and Technology at the Brookings Institution. She researches international politics, U.S. national security strategy, military applications of emerging technologies. And recently, she has been focusing on the Department of Defense's integration of artificial intelligence and machine learning capabilities into warfighting and enterprise institutions, which is absolutely fascinating. And among her other roles, she is on the advisory council of the North Rhine-Westphalian Academy for International Affairs. So a little Germany connection there as well. And she has also published Military Coercion in U.S. Foreign Policy, the Use of Force Short of War, which I think we can see some themes related to that coming up today. So thank you so much for coming today. And we're pleased to have both of you. All right, so we can get started. So Phil, first of all, I want to give you an opportunity to discuss your report, which to a great extent deals with risk, how different states perceive and how they handle it. So give us a run through. How should we be managing risk? How much should we be imposing risk? And how much risk are we willing to accept?
Absolutely. So first of all, thanks so much for having us, and thanks for supporting the report. I should say, first of all, also thank you to my team at the National Security Policy Center, particularly Claire Odo and John Robinson, who were also authors on this report and did a fantastic job on this. The report's available. I don't want to get into a summary of it in too sort of gritty detail, since that'll bore people to tears, I'm sure, and it's there for them. But I think just to sort of get the conversation started, the way that we wanted to sort of convey this is that there are elements of the way that we think about risk, particularly in Western democracies like the United States, like Germany, that are a little bit out of step with how we might think about risk in a deterrence framework if we were trying to deter most effectively. And in particular, there are sort of pathologies baked into our policy processes that cause us to, for very good reasons, try to sort of buy down risk whenever it's cheapest, right? And so we'll often reduce risk for adversaries by sort of turning the temperature down across sort of what we end up calling a portfolio of relationships in the places where we can. And so what that often will do is it'll leave a relationship with one particularly sort of hot issue area, right? While the other sort of components of it are comparatively cooler. And the result of that is it puts all the pressure on that particular space that we are not particularly well positioned to deter, right? And it simplifies the strategic calculation of adversaries in ways that actually, in our view, increase the overall propensity for kind of catastrophic failure, for a serious thing to kind of go sideways on you. And so this isn't really pointing to things that we didn't understand in the deterrence literature and the way people have been talking about deterrence going all the way back to shelling. It's more that sometimes I think we sort of lose sight, deterrence is an incredibly complicated topic. And sometimes we sort of lose sight of particular threads and they need to be sort of resurrected. And so from a policy standpoint, I think a lot of what this is saying is we need to take a longer term view of the maintenance of relationships that we have with adversaries. And we need to be willing to accept buying up risk, sometimes in uncomfortable ways, in the short term, in service of longer term deterrence.
And in that vein, I want to get into what has basically been our aversion to risk, right? So we're having these high risk areas, and then we're not calculating where risk can hurt us in the long run and potentially giving our adversaries an advantage in the evolving security landscape. So can you talk a little bit more about how us making those decisions can potentially hurt us?
Sure. I mean, one of the examples that we put out there for at least a thought experiment to think about is that, perhaps we made Russia's strategic calculation a little bit too easy with regard to Ukraine, right? That we kind of across a series of provocative relationships, whether they are interdictions that are happening with, aircraft on NATO borders, or various things that have occurred sort of on the high seas, or Russian provocations in the cyber domain, or all of these sorts of, it's a multifaceted relationship. There are lots of places where we are interacting with a country as sizable and as significant as Russia on a day-to-day basis. By sort of consistently giving way on those and saying, well, this is not the most significant thing, we're going to sort of not fight on the fight is the wrong word, but we're not going to contest on this particular provocation. You allow a situation to emerge where you get simplification across a risk portfolio, right? And so Russia is sort of saying like, most things are more or less under control. And so maybe we're in a position to sort of try our hand in a place like Ukraine, right? If you sort of imagine a counterfactual where Russia was really sort of running into significant headwinds on various of these other dimensions, the notion that we're developing is that that could lead an adversary to have pause, right? And sort of the same logic holds, I think, when it comes to a place like China, right, where you have a really tough strategic situation when it comes to Taiwan, right? Incredibly challenging to deter a situation where the interests are so strong, the proximity is so close, the capabilities are so sort of acute. But there are a lot of other places where a country like China is worrying about its overall security, right? And so if you exacerbate and turn the dial up a little bit on those, you deter on the main point of contestation, sort of away from that point of contestation. It's not foolproof. The idea is not to say that this is something, again, it is truly risk, but and it is not an absolute, but as we kind of think about how we're posturing ourselves, the call in the report is for a little bit of a realignment towards thinking about this a bit more holistically.
And I think you made some great points, and we're definitely going to have an opportunity to get into both China and Russia a little bit later. But first, I want to make sure we have a pretty strong understanding of what we're talking about when we're talking about deterrence and risk and how they are interrelated. So you've had an opportunity to say a few things. Maybe we can open this conversation up a little bit as well.
Great, thanks. Well, so thanks very much for having me. It's a real pleasure to be here and on the occasion of the introduction of this paper, which I think is really interesting. So it bears a good close read. I think one thing that comes out to me, just even from your comments today, is that I come from a very different place when I think about deterrence and risk. So the first thing I'll say is that I think about deterrence as a form of coercion, because that's what it is, right? It is trying to influence another actor's decision, not control it. All we can do is influence. And so when I think about risk in that context, the very first question that has to be asked is on the side of the deterror, which is, how much do we care about this thing? And how much are we willing to pay in order for that thing not to happen, right? So we're trying to stop somebody from doing something, we want to deter it. How much do we care about it, and how much is it worth to us? And that first step has to inform part of our strategy about how we then go about deterring an unwanted behavior. The other side of that risk, of course, has to do with what risk is the other actor willing to tolerate. So we need to understand what motivates them. What do they care about? Do they value it? Do we have a sense of how much they value it? So that when we levy a threat, which is what deterrence is, you levy a threat against something the other side cares about, that we have reason to believe that that will access something for them, that will affect their decision-making calculation. And so deterrence is a really difficult thing to access. It's a difficult thing to study. It's a difficult thing to understand because all of these things are mostly invisible. Right? We can't see really what another actor fundamentally cares about. We might have good information, but it will be incomplete information. It will not be thorough, totally accurate information. And so there's some inference involved. Similarly, I think it's fair to say, at least for the American national security apparatus, it's not so clear what we care about and how much we're willing to pay for it. We don't necessarily take a lot of time to have that introspection. Life is busy. The inbox is happening, and we're all fallible human beings, right? So these things are all invisible. So what I worry about when it comes to risk is really that first part. What do we care about? How much do we care about it? Then how do we design the strategy accordingly? Because there is always the risk that the deterrence will fail because we don't control it. The other side does, right? And as much as we think that we know, we've been surprised before. So it's probabilistic. There's always a chance that the other actor will choose to move anyway. Then we need to be really concerned about the interaction of our strategy with that choice. Are we well positioned to only pay the costs that we're willing to bear? Or have we put ourselves in worst case scenario situation where we, by merit of deterrence failing, are in sort of the least favorable circumstance for ourselves? So, I think this idea of a risk portfolio and thinking holistically has some very useful elements to it. And probably it'll touch on some integrated deterrence conversation that we can have later on. And I always just will start from that very first principle of we might select where in that portfolio to elevate risk based on how much we care and how much we're willing to pay.
I think that's an excellent point. And I think there's certainly different jumping off points that we can go from there. But I want to give you an opportunity if you'd like to respond to
I
that.
think that's an incredibly well taken set of points. And the way I sort of think about what you're raising here is that there are sort of better and worse bargains as you're making those calculations, right? There are things that we care about less and others care about more. There are places where capabilities are aligned in more favorable ways. And a lot of what I'm interested in, I think, is the notion that in our sort of cognitive policy process to sort of get to the things that we truly care about, even if we haven't calculated it perfectly, we often don't sort of think, again, holistically about where the bargains lie, right? Where the places are where we can apply pressure in ways that might rebalance in ways that advantage us. And so I think that, certainly moving back to those first principles maybe allows us to make that calculation more accurately.
Yeah, no, I think that's a great way to put it. The other thing, the other part I would add to it is part of gaining advantage and selecting where we can press or leave space open allows us then, I think, to funnel unwanted activity in certain directions and away from others, because we can't presume that whatever our strategy is, that other actors aren't going to behave in ways that are consistent with what they believe to be their own enlightened self-interest, right? So it would be lovely if everybody was just status quo and didn't want to trouble anybody else, but that's not how human interactions work. And so if we can take advantage of, as you're saying, these cognitive models to not just prevent the things we really don't want to have happen, but make space for, those energies to be located in areas that we don't find particularly dangerous or threatening, or that we feel are more manageable, then that would be another benefit of approaching a risk portfolio and profile.
Yeah, no, I think that's exactly right. And there is this sort of element of it where I think kind of moving into that logic that you're describing allows one to potentially become more tolerant of short-term irritants in favor of kind of long-term stability maintenance. And that's one thing that I think the sort of myopic process toward escalation control, the sort of obsession with escalation control, tends to lead us to a place where we keep tamping things down while the overall pressure in a relationship grows. And that's a little bit what the report is driving at, is this notion that you actually sort of, by managing across a bit more rather than just sort of reflexively tamping down escalation without a calculation of the true risk, leads you to places where catastrophic failure, like Ukraine, we can get into the extent to which we think this is, the Israel story has bearing here or not. I think it's maybe only a loose parallel, but then also future-looking places like Taiwan. One needs to be thinking about that, in my view.
Yeah, I absolutely agree with that, and I think, in part, because if we're two things that lead us, I think, to increase pressure in ways that are not overall helpful, this escalation concern that you have, but also especially with particular adversaries, Russia, China in particular right now, because we've framed these relationships as fundamentally adversarial. We call China the adversary, for example, on a very regular basis. And we now have this phenomenon called the gray zone, which is just sort of activities that we kind of don't like, but we can't exactly say why, that it inflates the importance of every one of those things in a way that doesn't reflect, as you say, sort of a real think through of what's at stake and why, not just in the discrete, immediate, short-term moment, but more broadly over the long term. So I think your differentiation of management over time is really important as well.
Yeah, I really agree with that very strongly, and particularly this notion of sort of, a prior report, we talked some about gray zone for the Adenauer Foundation. But there is this sort of linkage between this gray zone story and, the very highest level of deterrence that I think often gets sort of appreciated, and in particular, the extent to which, I like the way you put it in terms of, gray zone being just kind of stuff we don't like. It might annoy us a little bit, but we don't really know exactly why or what the limitations are on that. But, this notion that often it works in such a way that the preponderant power picks the guardrails on the higher levels of deterrence, but that leaves open, for very straightforward theoretical reasons, the ability of the lesser power to pick within those guardrails. And that's where the gray zone happens. And so I think we often get into these conversations where it's, why is the US always losing in the gray zone? But the reason for that is we actually picked the bounds with which the gray zone exists. And one of the things we're sort of driving toward in these reports and in sort of other work that surrounds it is this connection between, being able to pick the big stuff and then having to be somewhat more tolerant of how contestation works when it comes to the little stuff, as you were describing it.
Yeah, and I think that's an opportunity too to talk about what actually deterrence can mean in these different theaters. So, I mean, we had talked about strategic versus non-strategic deterrence, and we also have other different categories like nuclear versus non-nuclear, war versus short of war, and general deterrence versus immediate deterrence. So maybe we can get into also a little bit more how different ideas of deterrence break down even further when we get into those niche categories. Would you like to start?
Yeah, absolutely. This is one of the things that I think makes the deterrence conversation so hard. And you were sort of alluding to this already, but often we don't have our terminology quite right, and we don't have shared understanding on what it is we're actually talking about. And in particular, I think it's very hard to talk coherently about deterrence in a serious way if you have not articulated what it is that you're trying to deter, right? And so, one of my old variants of the notebooks that you all carry around had, written on the front as a permanent reminder, deterrence failure does not equal bad thing happened, right? Because there is this sort of general idea sometimes, particularly as you translate backward from the theoretical to the political, that anytime a bad thing happens, there has been some significant deterrence failure, right? But you can't accept risk without accepting the possibility of failure, right? That is something that can happen. It's the flip side of the same coin. And so one of the places where we're very sloppy is we often will take ideas that come from strategic deterrence, the sort of the things that we mapped out very coherently with regard to mutually assured destruction and all these kind of logics of nuclear deterrence, and try to apply them down the chain. So one of the things that we're attempting to do with this sort of portfolio concept is think about sort of how you would start articulating particular dimensions of deterrence, particular points of contestation, particular types of risk, and then map them kind of across a set of relationships with a state, and then frankly sort of rank them in some sense in terms of what you're willing to accept in those relationships and what you're not willing to accept. And so, this is only the beginning of a conversation in which, a great number of people are involved, but I do think there needs to be a much more coherent view of this mapping between these different types of deterrence that you're talking about. And how they interrelate with one another, and frankly, a move away from postures where we're saying, well, this is totally unacceptable, and yet then we accept it, and obviously that's not fantastic from a signaling standpoint.
Yeah. So I think I'll highlight, foot stomp, whatever the term of art in Washington is these days, for a thing that you said with which I agree, which is the idea of focusing on what outcome it is that we're trying to achieve. And so, there's any number of interpretations and definitions floating around. Everybody will have their own. My personal pet rock, because I, again, sort of err towards simplicity, is to say, I think about strategic deterrence as applying to nuclear weapons. And the outcome there is that we don't want to be hit by one, right? In particular. So that's where I sort of been the outcome of interest when it comes to strategic deterrence. And those two go together. General deterrence, I sort of loosely consider the whole bundle of non-nuclear things that we would prefer not to have happen, interests that we would prefer that nobody else challenges, preferences, norms, standards, whatever, again, you like to call these things, that we would just really like everybody to go along and get along with and not bother us with disliking it and behaving in ways that demonstrate that they dislike it, right? So a general sense of let's keep everything cool and generally to our liking. And then there's immediate deterrence, whereas someone has decided they're not just going to keep it cool and do things the way that we prefer, that they are going to do something that challenges our interest or our preference, not necessarily because it challenges our interests or our preference, because again, other actors, we always have to remember, it's not always about us, right? They are doing the things that they think are in their interests. It might have the unfortunate effect of being something that we don't like or find challenging or threatening, but that's not necessarily their purpose, right? So immediate deterrence is something like that has arisen, and we then have to decide if we're going to do something about it or not. If it's a place in the portfolio, in the relationship, that it has touched on a behavior that we think is just categorically unacceptable for whatever reasons, and therefore we are going to try to actively prevent that next behavior on the part of that actor, right? So when I think about the immediate deterrence, it's a much more, we tend to call those moments crises. I think that in some sense inflates what they are or how we ought always to think about them. Nonetheless, they are discrete moments in time where we think an actor is going to do something that we don't like and have decided that it is necessary for us to actively try to deter them. And then it's a question of what strategy, how do we find their values and motivations, and what tools can we bring to bear to affect that and their calculation process.
I think a really key part of that again, I'll foot stomp right back and we'll turn it into a stomping party or something, is this component of sort of the categorically unacceptable, right? And I think one of the things that's really important to note as we move down that ladder from strategic deterrence is the only one of these categories that even begins to have kind of bright line boundaries about it is strategic deterrence, right? And even that, those boundaries can be fudged in ways by adversaries that are potentially important, right? And so there's always this sort of error term around what is kind of categorically unacceptable that adversaries will play with, right? And that capacity to sort of introduce that uncertainty is why we're often in this place where there's this perceptional component to deterrence and to provocation that makes all of this a lot riskier, right? And so part of what we're driving at is this notion of kind of how we operate with regard to that uncertainty. Because as we move from kind of model to reality, the uncertainty to me is where all the problems lie, right? But when you go to kind of the game theoretic stuff, obviously that's all just sort of washed away. But I think that's sort of an important way to think about the points that were raised.
I think we can have a lot more to say about those topics, but I also, in the interest of time, I want to make sure that we get into talking a little bit more about Russia's invasion of Ukraine and sort of the lessons that we learned from that, and then possibly even the implications for that as we're looking at other potential threats, whether that is China or something else. So why don't we start with you, because you mentioned a little bit also in your paper about sort of the lessons that we were learning from Ukraine and how.
Yeah, I mean, I think, and I've already said a bit, so I'll only say a bit more and then pass the baton, because I'd be very interested in sort of your perspectives on the Russia-Ukraine question. But, I think there is a real open question as to the extent to which Russia was deterrable in this situation, right? And I'll put out there, one of the things I say most often to sort of students is an acceptable answer in these sorts of situations is I don't know, or we don't know. The interests were very poorly aligned in terms of how badly they cared about this versus, and this kind of goes to the points you were raising, how much they cared about this versus how much we cared about this, how easy this was for them to execute as opposed to how hard it was for us to prevent. And so there were a whole bunch of reasons to suggest that this was, especially sitting in an armchair a year later, to say that this was sort of something that was coming in a way. What I would say about it is that we may have made it a little bit easier on them, right? For the reasons that I already laid out in terms of kind of getting out of the way of a lot of these other points of contestation. And so, was it ultimately deterrable? Perhaps not within what we were willing to pay. But could we have potentially complicated that decision-making? I would argue we absolutely could have if we had been somewhat more risk acceptant in contesting Russian aggression in other places in Europe, in cyberspace, in outer space, in all sorts of other places where we had consistently, I think, demonstrated that our aversion to escalation was going to play in their favor.
Right. So a couple things I would say to that extent, it may simply have been that they correctly interpreted our signals in that regard, right? That they correctly understood the extent of our interests and made their choices with that information on board. When I reflect on the lead up to Russia's invasion, I think through the quality of the strategy that the US administration with allies and partners put together. And I actually think that there's much more to commend it than there is to criticize about it. I think that the fact that it might not have proved compelling and ultimately coercive for Putin may indeed reflect exactly what Phil has said, is that that Putin's thought process had been set based on the information he had received. He had a schema in place and it was not going to be changed by any updating, or he simply, for some other reason, felt that he and Russia could withstand the costs that were being threatened. We didn't adequately access or couldn't access the thing or things that would make him movable, if those even existed. It's a good reminder, I think, that not all behaviors are deterrable. Failure is always a possibility. And your strategy can be really good and still have failure as an outcome. The one thing I will say that in hindsight, one might quibble with in terms of the presentation of the Allied strategy was that President Biden very early on took US troop involvement off the table and said very clearly that it was not going to happen. Now, I think it's excellent that he knew that for himself and that the position of the national security apparatus here was that this is something that we are not ready to commit to and will not commit to. The saying it out loud part may have been unhelpful in terms of, again, affecting what kind of risk that Putin at least had to consider he would be facing if he chose to go through.
Same spirit, but one other thing that I might, again, I think the policy, particularly post-invasion from the Biden administration, has been pretty impressive. You know, whether us saying we held out the possibility of putting boots on the ground, I question the extent to which that would have been credible, given our interests in the region and the potentially sort of catastrophic consequences of that. But one thing that I think would have been credible that was sort of about this escalation control dynamic was the sort of dribs and drabs with different systems that we agreed to along the way, right? You know, again, very hard to know the counterfactual here, but there is a story where if the US had been much more willing to green light various capabilities earlier on in this conflict, that could have both had effects on battlefield capability, but potentially even in the strategic logic of Russia. I would definitely heavily discount that second factor because they just seem to be very, very all in. But you do see this sort of aversion to escalation built into the way we've sort of agreed to those different systems over time.
I think what I would say to that is so first, in terms of credible threats or not, my preference would have been that just simply say nothing about troop involvement, right? Don't have to say we are, don't have to say we aren't. In fact, we don't have we're not treaty allies with Ukraine, which essentially says exactly that, which is there's no guarantee that we will, but there shouldn't also necessarily be a guarantee that we won't, which sounds like another geography that we can talk about later. But so I think in that case, just saying nothing would have been preferable. In terms of the dribs and drabs afterwards, we have to also acknowledge that that was us being deterred. That is us being deterred by Russia. And there's nothing wrong with that. There's a lot of criticism, and people like to have used this phrase about self-deterrence, that we're deterring ourselves because we're so risk averse. Nope, we're just being deterred. That's somebody else having a strategy that is effective because it accesses risks we're not willing to take. And so what we've seen is that, I think, updating of information, certainly in terms of weapon systems that we're willing to accept the risk of sending, and it's happening incrementally. No doubt it would have had a bigger effect had it happened right away, but it's also possible that one of those effects might have been direct US war with Russia, or Russia attacking a NATO ally, or some other unwanted outcome. Right?
Yeah, and I totally agree with what you said. It's a very well put set of points. The thing that I think sort of throws this is kind of one of the things you raised earlier on, which is we don't get to observe the events that we didn't observe, right? And so, there's a very much sort of a 2020 hindsight component to the story. My position on this, acknowledging the hindsight component of it, is that signals suggest that probably if we'd moved incrementally faster than we did, right, some unit faster than we did, we would not have ended up in World War III with Russia, right? And to me, this just becomes sort of emblematic of a policy process that on balance gives rise to risk-averse, non-escalatory responses, right? To the point that, when we do, war games and things along these lines, a lot of the direction that comes down from the top is avoid escalation, right? As sort of a vanilla thing to say. Not always, but sometimes, right? And so that component that's kind of baked into the way we tend to think about what a good outcome looks like can, at least under some circumstances, lead to, it can help us avoid the absolute worst outcomes, but it leads us potentially to sort of suboptimal outcomes.
No disagreement on that. I mean, you use the word that there are some pathologies in our process along the way, and I think that's a very good example of one of them. When I think, when I hear what you've described about somewhat, we can call it a conservative nature in terms of how we approach these things, there's a phrase that you'll often hear, which is, well, we can do that, sir, but just not at an acceptable cost. Right. But without specifying them, what is the acceptable cost and where are we putting those thresholds and why? And we have that, as you say, baked in.
And before we're going to have an opportunity to do some audience questions as well. But again, I just do want to have an opportunity to talk about China in a little bit more detail as well, because there are lessons to be learned, maybe different lessons from you see different lessons from Russia's invasion of Ukraine between the two of you. But how can we see their behavior, their current behavior, and how they're acting in the context of deterrence and accepting calculated risk? And maybe we can also touch on what are our friends and allies' roles in this conversation when it comes to future deterrence, and whether that be with China or with anyone.
Please go ahead.
Well, so the first thing in terms of one of the questions that comes up rightfully and regularly is, what are the sort of lessons or parallels between Ukraine and Taiwan in particular? I think that there are some. I just tend to think that they're different than what people are really looking to hear about. Which is to say that it accesses, Phil, your point again about what's deterrable and what isn't, and why, and the context of relationships over time. So I'm not of the mind to say that the lesson here is that Xi Jinping is equally as undeterrable as Vladimir Putin was. The lesson I take a little bit more is about historical grievances and about whether and how we address them adequately, how we manage them in the relationship, and how they've manifested in ways other than a direct invasion of the territory in question. We disagreed with Putin's grievances about NATO expansion and sort of, just approached that as a nonsense kind of line of argument for a very long time. And China has similar grievances about U.S. relations in East Asia and with Taiwan in particular. And we might think that those grievances are unfounded or unreasonable or illiberal or whatever word we want to apply to it. And yet they are grievances, and they are taken seriously by the people that have them. And eventually we have to consider that they will act on them. Not in a vacuum, but in relation to the strategies that we take. So my concern, in part about these parallels being drawn, is that there has been a tendency to take the lesson that we need to be much more firm militarily in presenting our deterrent posture. That was one of the failings in Ukraine, and we cannot afford for that to be a failing over Taiwan. And in our zeal to deter, we are forgetting that the other half of a deterrent relationship is assurance, which is to say, if you do not do this thing, then we will not do this other thing, right? We won't punish you. We will exercise restraint in these ways. And I think that signal in terms of the US involvement with the Taiwan question is getting much more muted, both in terms of what we're doing militarily, but also what we see politically on the Hill and in other places emanating out of Washington, DC and other allied capitals as well. So maybe I'll pause there, and I'd be interested to hear what Phil has to say.
I agree fully with that, and I'd go even one step further, which is one of the complaints you hear out of Beijing consistently, is sort of, variants of why won't you let us, a great power, do great power kinds of things, right? So what are we allowed to do? What's acceptable? And so beyond sort of assurance with regard to our own, we won't do X, sort of like, well, we will accept that you will do certain things that honestly we can't stop you from doing anyway. And so we may as well sort of say, sure, well, why not, right? And so there does need to be a realm of the acceptable. And I think that I fully agree with you there. Another thread you drew out that I'll pull on a little bit is this sort of zeal to be this sort of ultimate deterror, right? And sort of say, well, our capabilities are going to be the reason that you're not going to go and do this thing in Taiwan, whatever it might be, right? I think kind of mistakes that a lot of what we're concerned about is the actual outcome, not kind of the process by which we got there, right? And we tend to have these conversations about, well, if we have been successful at deterrence, that means that China no longer wants to take Taiwan or never will take Taiwan or some variant therein. Whereas from an operational standpoint, deterrence just means not today, right? It just means that for one more day, they didn't do the thing that we didn't want them to do. Right. And that's part of the theme here, is that you can cause or enjoy somebody else causing not today from there are all kinds of ways that get you to that place. Right. And some of them you're actively doing in very military sorts of ways. But, I'll hazard that if for some reason China feels that its domestic house is not in order and that acting on Taiwan would make that worse rather than better, they'll say not today, right? And so again, this much more sophisticated, I think, understanding of where deterrence is sort of coming from and happening from at sort of any given moment of time, that's a little bit the theme that I would be really pushing as we move away from a Russia conversation into a more prescriptive conversation about other potential adversaries.
Yeah, I think that's a really excellent point, and I hope policymakers here and in other places will take that to heart, because especially when it comes to the Taiwan question, I think the best outcome is going to be not today for a very long time into the future. We just want to prolong that time horizon as much as we can.
Yeah, and in some ways, imagining that you can force an adversary to say out loud that they no longer care about a thing that they have said they care. It's a weirdly high bar. Right, like we don't,
but also we don't believe you anyway.
Right. Yeah, it wouldn't be credible. It wouldn't be credible. And so, but sometimes just by sort of having these conversations out loud, you realize the extent to which sort of these little threads of magical thinking kind of creep into some of the way we have these conversations. And I think that's just important to get out there.
That's excellent. Well, I would love to open it up to the audience for some questions now as well. If you have a question, you can just raise your hand. You can say your name and affiliation. And yeah.
Hi, this is Polly Kime at NSA. So I know you mentioned this briefly, the concept of integrated deterrence. How does that fit in with your theory of this portfolio of risk? Thanks.
Thanks. Yeah, I mean, I think I'd love to hear your thoughts on the sort of integrated deterrence conversation as well. My take is that, while it's always good to sort of connect the dots, so to speak, and try to make everything internally coherent and sort of close all the gaps, that it risks catastrophic failure in a similar way, right? That you can't eventually sort of close off every avenue in a way that will lead an adversary to say, I give up, right? And so to me, the integrated deterrence is a sort of an overly inward facing solution to a problem that is in a lot of ways kind of more externally facing.
So it's funny, we clearly have internalized integrated deterrence very differently, because I think about integrated deterrence as how we think about the means that we're going to use, how we're going to go about affecting the decision-making process of another actor. And to that extent, and I say this not in a disparaging way, but just to sort of illustrate it, it feels like calling it integrated deterrence sort of is putting like lipstick on a pig a little bit, right? It's just still just deterrence, you know, like it's just now we're sort of acknowledging that it's not exclusively military deterrence. It's trying to use other tools, whether they're economic tools or diplomatic tools or, you know, I don't know, cultural tools, whatever it might be, to persuade another actor of something. The interesting part to me about it sort of being a feature here in the United States of the National Defense Strategy is then it actually should precipitate conversations about how meaningful interagency coordination during moments of immediate deterrence are actually going to happen. Is Treasury talking to DOD? Is DOD talking to state? Are they all talking to each other? Who's in charge of coordinating that strategy? You know, those sorts of things. So, you know, one of those interesting questions that we will keep asking the policy apparatus, but I don't have too much heartburn about integrated deterrence. And I would really actually prefer if we did it. You know, I think in part that would enable the kinds of thinking that you're talking about.
I think that's right. And it's not so much that I see it differently than you see it. It's much more that I'm sort of reflecting on the flip side of it, which is that how it's manifesting inside of our own governmental processes. And part of my concern is that it identifies a very similar problem, right? Which is that there's this whole portfolio of different ways in which actors are engaging with one another. And so we want a multifaceted view of what deterrence really is, right? In the way it's actually starting to manifest, my concern would be that it's becoming another way in which we're consistently looking to sort of buy down risk on all dimensions, right? So we're going to have a very sort of nuanced interagency process that's going to cause us to sort of close all the chinks in the armor, and therefore we're not going to see escalation on any of these dimensions. So, you know, I think done well, it could achieve great things, and I agree with you. I would like to see that, but my concern would be that both where it came from and the way it's being applied maybe carries forward some of these concerns. So, you know, maybe TBD on this one for me personally.
We have other questions from the audience.
Hey, my name is Adrian and I'm working in cybersecurity. So also my question is about Cyberwars. Maybe to prepare the question, you can also disagree with some of the perceptions I have. So how I see it is that a cyber war battleground is being prepared. We haven't seen an actual cyber war yet. And after the invasion of Ukraine, I don't know if this is a commonly known fact or not, like Russia accidentally activated backdoors in Germany and shut off windmills for 2 or 3 hours, right? And investigations after that concluded that a lot of systems in Germany are compromised and are exposed to other threat actors. And this is an interesting setting right now because the US is very well protected and they're quite in the front of this preparation of the battleground. But how do you see deterrence in terms of the German-US relation, where we know, I don't know if you consider this a fact or not, but where we know that Germany is quite compromised and US is quite strong in the cybersecurity affairs?
Were we able to hear the question there? I think we had a little.
Well, so let me say first, when it comes to the words cyber and deterrence together, I mean, bells start going off in my head and I kind of want to go curl up in a fetal position somewhere because it just feels like the Wild West and impossible. And I don't even quite know how to think about what it means. And I know there are some very smart people out there thinking very hard about what it actually means, how you could implement a strategy of deterrence in cyberspace. The best my little brain can do to think about it meaningfully right now is that the fact of everybody's vulnerability in cyberspace. The United States may be doing well, as you've described. The United States is far from invulnerable to cyber incursions. And we've had object lessons in that in terms of, the gas pipeline and, ransoms and other sorts of things. And what I think it opens up in terms of a deterrence conversation is we now have to acknowledge, we, the United States, at least, we've sat over here in our very nice two ocean sort of lifestyle, friends on either side, right? It's very comfortable sort of place to live. That now, let's say China would like to send us a message. And they can do that from afar and in non-kinetic ways. And if we were ever involved in a kinetic action in the Western Pacific, we shouldn't believe that the homeland is impermeable and invulnerable anymore because of those cyber tools, that there are things that can happen. And that changes the bargaining situation. That changes the appreciation and recognition of risk and decision-making around it. So I, again, have to sort of think about it at that sort of upper level engagement, not down in the weeds. The last thing I'll say is, given acknowledgement of compromise, the United States historically has been very, let's call it reticent to share technologies, to have open systems, to do that kind of interoperability. That's not going to change, despite our own failings and flaws and vulnerabilities as well. But the more vulnerabilities and risks that are introduced into the relationship, the less close that relationship will technologically end up being.
Yeah, I share the reticence to talk too much about deterrence in the cyber domain. It feels a little bit like talking about deterrence sort of mid-fight in World War I trench warfare or something, right? It's all going on all the time. But it's also, not going on above a certain threshold. And so I think, it is useful to think a little bit about the why of, maybe it being hard to talk about deterrence in that domain. Some of it has to do with the sort of credibility, right? So you have to have capability that's held in reserve. You have to have the ability to time that. You have to have credibility of response. You have to have sort of credibility of threat. There are a whole bunch of things that are true about a stable deterrence framework that are not at all stable in the cyber domain in ways that I think, are what you're describing as sort of the Wild West, right? So there's a fundamental difference between the sort of means cyber and the ends. There are certain things that, if somebody conducts a cyber attack on our strategic capabilities, well, then suddenly the deterrence thing becomes quite simple, right? That's no longer a significant problem at all, actually. It's a very simple problem. And so to me, what Russia and the Ukraine conflict have done is really helped put cyber in the right place in terms of the variety of tools that are available to us or the globe, in the sense that clearly, and again, experts in this domain wouldn't be surprised by this, but Russia was not able to put a bunch of people in hoodies to like strategically take down the exact systems they wanted to take down at the exact right time so that they could come crashing through. That's not how this works. And so it's much more about, hey, here's a place we happen to have access at this moment, at this time. We may employ an effect. It's going to have uncertain results. And all of those things, I think, allow us to mature our understanding of how cyber fits in this kind of broader deterrent framework.
One, maybe two short questions.
Josh Powers, SPA. Phil and Melanie, thanks so much for being here today. I got a lot out of the discussion. I'd like to pull the string on a couple of things that you guys talked about. And Phil, you talked about, what are great power allowable things and how do we manage those things that we can't really deter anyway? How does China's perception of competition and the fact that they may view competition as zero sum, how does that play into that? And then how does that lead to some of the things Melanie's been talking about? What are China's perceptions of escalation and how is it different from our own? Thanks.
Yeah, I mean, just on the first part of that, I think we do need to take the sort of, we often talk a lot about responding at a time and place of our choosing. We probably need to take that a little bit more seriously if this sort of risk portfolio idea is really to have any teeth, that time and place of our choosing needs to matter. And we probably need to be a little bit more comfortable talking about that, right? So a huge part of deterrence is communication and signaling, right? And I think, this gets into something we haven't touched too much on, but again, another pathology of our system is that it tends to be very highly classified and very highly kind of compartmentalized in terms of who's doing what, how, to whom. And some notion of when it would be useful to be louder and when it would be useful to be quieter from a strategically driven rather than bureaucratically driven standpoint might kind of contribute to some of the points you're raising.
So correct me if I'm not thinking about your first question the right way, but the sense of how does China think about competition and its zero-sum nature?
The thought that if we don't necessarily that anything.
So, first, what I would say is that I think China would say that it's the Americans who have a zero-sum approach to competition, not China. And, so on that basis, I think where it becomes different is they have for a long time felt that the US approach is to constrain, subdue, surround China and prevent it from being a great power and having all of the rights and privileges thereof. And so I think their perception of their behaviors is trying to brush us back off the plate and to create that space. And we see that in very concrete ways in the surrounding seas. And in particular, when we talk about those gray zone activities or behaviors that we can't decide if they're quite allowable or not. They were for a while, but now we're starting to decide that they really aren't, are things like being more forthright and aggressive about their territorial and sovereignty claims, about their rights to operate in those seas and not ours, and trying to sort of create that region as a zero-sum space. And so I think, I'm not sure I'm quite answering your question, but those are the sort of things that came to mind. In terms of escalation, I think China has a very sort of prescribed way in which they ratchet things up or down, and it moves from rhetoric through to behavior, and it tends to be very proportional. So we make a lot of noise about the militarized coercion around Taiwan in particular, and flights over the ADIZ and other sorts of things. Those are sort of calibrated to their offense at a particular action that we've taken. And so there's a way that we can interpret those messages rhetorically and otherwise. The things that they will not accept risk on are regime stability. And if we get that wrong, then we shouldn't be surprised if they escalate sort of well beyond what we might think is a reasonable reaction. So if I didn't get it and you want to chat later, I'm happy to do it. So that's thanks for tolerating the answer either way.
And I hate to cut the conversation short because I know I saw a couple more hands raised, but I think we are just about out of time. So I want to thank my panelists. I think Paul has a couple things that he would like to say as well.
I think this was quite a fascinating discussion. A lot of food for thought for all of us. Unfortunately, as Aaron said, we're running out of time. Thank you so much, first of all, to our audience. Thank you so much to our participants on Zoom, but a special sincere gratitude also to Melanie, to Phil, also for your report, and of course to Aaron. Let's give them a big hand. Thank you so much.